What up guys, it is Justice here and welcome back to another Runescape video. First off, what is kiting? Well, it's supposedly a well-known term within the RPG world, one I hadn't heard of until Acheron Mammoths, but a method which I have used elsewhere in the game of Runescape, such as hard mode Grador, where you run around the room not letting Grador touch you and thus preventing the boss monster's special attacks. So kiting in an MMORPG relates to the player grabbing a mob's attention and you'll keep walking away from it which pulls it along, not unlike a kite, and thus it was nicknamed kiting. Now, on day 1 of release, you'll notice me using this method here against the Acheron Mammoths. I've had to take it directly from my livestream and thus the reason this video is 720p rather than the usual 1080p. You'll notice me running away from the Acheron Mammoth to keep my distance and using my abilities on full manual, so using my ability and walking away from the boss in conjunction with each other, thus making the Mammoth walk after me. Now on day 1 of release, if you are not within melee distance, it prevented the Mammoth's adrenaline bar from charging up and thus it would never reach Pulverize, which is its 100% ability. And let's be honest, even if you're using melee and you're with an MD, I mean, whatever case you're at, whatever case you're using here at the Acheron Mammoths, it just never seems to reach 100% adrenaline anyway. And it would rarely barge me though, which is the big thing here. It would rarely use the barge ability. It would only really use barge once, like 1 out of 5 kills or so, because I was constantly running away, and even if it did barge, it wouldn't really get close enough to hurt me anyway. So the method here was just to stick Soul Split on, use magic, and you could also use Metamorphosis because you can move around. That's why I chose magic over range, and you get additional damage output when you use Metamorphosis, compared to range where you can only get additional damage output if you're using Death Swiftness. But this method would still work with range effectively, and with the combat triangle you would hit slightly better at the Acheron Mammoth with range if you weren't able to use meta with magic, on a constant basis. But anyways, that's why I chose magic. I also prefer using mage over range anyway. You could also use Ice Barrage or Ice Burst, and with Dark Form you'd have an increased chance of stunning the Mammoth with that ice attack. By using this method, you take a lot less damage, you take less barges, and thus a lower chance of dying, therefore transforming the Slayer task from a high risk task to a low risk task. But this was balanced and countered with much slower kills compared to melee, where you can Zerk and take a Mammoth out extremely fast, especially when using Drago Rapiers, due to Mammoths being weak to the stab attacks. So your task would take twice as long, but you'd use less food supplies with less risk of dying. Jagex could even program in a higher chance of the Mammoth barging even when kiting. Now, at the time, there were 600 people watching me using this kiting method over on Twitch, lots of hype around these Mammoths on first day of release, and after about 1 hour of using this method, I re-geared, went back to find it had been hotfixed, and it made it virtually impossible to use this method. If you weren't within melee distance for a certain amount of time, the range attacks seemed to have a higher chance of hitting you due to you being stunned and your run energy minimizing to 0 and your prayer being knocked off all at the same time. So overall you got completely shreked. If you tried to kite and whilst having to think about using freedom and anticipate to prevent the stuns, your run energy would still go to 0 anyway, so you would be able to kite until it charged back up. In the meantime, just getting shreked with range hits, and then it gets within melee distance, barges and everything just goes off, And in the meantime, the kills were already a lot slower anyway. Now they were even slower to a point that made it obsolete. I even tried going to Ooglog and taking a swim in the salt pool to get unlimited run. With 99 agility you get 25 minutes of unlimited run, but even with this, the fact of being constantly stunned by the Mammoths for being out of melee distance for too long just made the entire experience irritating and just not worth it, as using Anticipate and Freedom at the right time every time prevented DPS and your prayer just kept dropping anyway. So I feel when the kiting method worked on day 1 before the hotfix, the kills were twice as slow anyway, even when using meta compared to Zerk with melee, so you could choose between a higher risk strategy to get your Slayer task completed twice as fast with melee, or a low risk strategy with magic setup or range setup using the kiting method for much slower kills. If you wanted to grind these out, you'd most likely use the low risk method, but if you just had a task of 40 to 70 kills, I would personally use the higher risk strategy with melee. So it would give players that choice. From a developer's perspective, they invested a lot of time into the mechanics of this boss fight. of this boss, you know what I mean, of the Slayer creature. I keep saying boss, and yes, kiting did minimize the chance of Mammoth barging you, it prevented you from getting hit with melee hits, and probably prevented the Sever ability, and the chance of your prayer dropping, but if they found a way of coding it so the Mammoth still barges randomly, it could work, giving the players more options. I don't have any major issues really if you were able to use the kiting method at Mammoth. At the end of the day, it's not making the task AFKable, because kiting still requires a lot of clicking. I mean, it's even balanced with you get less XP per hour if you use the kiting method. Also, I guess they try and balance monsters with like XP to GP per hour. If using the kiting method, you're going to be making less money per hour as well than the melee method. Although you're going to save a bit of cost and supplies here and there. Not quite sure what that'd add up to, but considering Mammoths right now, compared to pre-existing content, isn't that great GP per hour, is it really that bad putting kiting in, which are slower kills anyway, and thus people are going to make less GP per hour if they want to choose kiting over the more high-risk strategy of melee? Now, yeah, I've been saying high risk in this video. Mammoths aren't as high risk as some of the previous high-level mobs, but for a Slayer task, I have heard a lot of people who are fairly disappointed with them being, as risky as they are for a Slayer task and for the rewards that you're getting out of it. So maybe having kiting there with a lower risk strategy but slower kills per hour, it might give people more of an incentive to actually, participate in killing these high-level mobs, and Jagex would see more people fighting them as well, to a point where people start really enjoying the gameplay and the mechanics, and then they want to give the melee higher risk approach a go and want to get faster kills per hour. And Jagex could even take out kiting later down the line when they feel the game is developed to a point or evolved to a point where they really don't want that in the game. And at the end of the day, kiting is still very click intensive. Thank you guys for watching. What do you think? And I'll see you in the next one.